The Masai Mara National Reserve, with its well-known geographical features, like a 10-foot-tall model of René Descartes, and its migrating herds of metaphysics. But this landscape is also home to much more humble creatures. Here we see a traditional epistemology in its natural habitat. A defining attribute of this theory of knowledge is that it thinks of knowledge acquisition as an individual process, where someone uses reason and observation to obtain truths. Its general vibe is that of a French dude, locking himself in a stove for a couple of weeks and discovering it can't doubt its own existence.
I'm out here in the wild trying to spot a social epistemology. This creature is a very different beast, since it accepts that we rely on other people for a large portion of our knowledge. For example, if some scientists were to discover something new about the Higgs boson, then I wouldn't need to build my own particle accelerator and replicate the results in order to know about it. I could just trust them.
Ugh, this is nonsense. If knowledge has a social component, then it's important to look at how the knowledge of oppressed groups is discounted from influential bodies of knowledge. But they never talk about that now. Epistemology has often regarded such questions as peripheral. Ha! Kant said, in short, this fellow was quite black from head to foot, a clear proof that what he said was stupid. Philosophy has systematically dispelled the views of black people and still hasn't dealt with the legacy.
Let's have a little look at how white supremacy has shaped belief formation through the ages. The assumption of superiority is kind of self-confirming. If you think of yourself as superior, you tend to interpret difference as inferiority. In the colonial period, Europeans could think of empty lands which were actually full of millions of people, and they could think of Americans as hunter-gatherers despite their widespread engagement in agriculture. Europeans were even able to ignore the fact that settlers of the Plymouth colony were taught a number of agricultural techniques by a member of the Patsuzak. Equally, resistance from colonised people was often interpreted as the work of a small number of troublemakers, or in the case of passive resistance, attributed to laziness. Here's a quote from a missionary to the Cherokee in 1840. Whites try and fail to find out what Indians know because they refuse to recognise the humanity and intelligence of native peoples. Such persons may spend all their days among Indians and yet die as ignorant of their true character, almost as if they'd never been born. On top of the conviction that colonialism was fine, you also had the conviction that colonisation was an altruistic pursuit. For example, you have something like the John Stuart Mill brand of racism, where he argued that people of colour weren't inherently inferior, but they needed to learn Western rationality and governance by being colonised. This led him to write lines like, "Any attempt Britain makes to exert influence is rather in service of others than of itself." Equally, you had popular ideas like the white man's burden to civilise the world. Supremacist beliefs furthered white group interests, as there's rather a few financial incentives in empire building, and also it's rather unpleasant to see yourself as a genocidal monster. This was a big factor in the creation and continuation of such beliefs, but they also took on a whole life of their own, as a lot of white critics of imperialism also couldn't really see past that framework. For example, someone like Joseph Conrad in A Heart of Darkness has this idea that the resource extraction and brutality of colonialism are bad and presumably should stop, but he doesn't quite make the leap to understanding that the colonised people who could play some sort of active role in regaining their independence. He has this idea of a darkness ready to reclaim Africa if the colonists left, but he isn't able to extend this idea to think of a people who had been organising their own societies before being colonised and would do so again after.
And now a word from this video's sponsor. Do you want to continue to be a racist bastard whilst claiming that you have the best interests of people of colour at heart? You're in luck, because here at Millcorps we offer a 5-step programme so you can do just that, including guest lectures by Conrad and Dickens. Follow the link in the description for £10 off our weekly subscription fees of £5,000. Millcorps, proud sponsors of Quest Grunny Productions.
Such thoughts have continued into the present day. Mozambique has been rather worried that it's going to struggle financially as a result of the measures it needs to take to avoid an outbreak of the coronavirus. Thus, it's applied for a rapid relief loan to the IMF. To get a loan from the IMF, they need to adopt fiscal policies which the IMF likes, which, as they rather desperately need the money, basically amounts to the IMF dictating what they should do. The policies Mozambique has had to adopt include wage freezes and removing VAT exemptions from certain goods. Mozambique has VAT exceptions on goods like maize, bread, paraffin for lighting, mosquito nets, condoms, some bikes, medicine, medical and educational services, and, most importantly, the supply of staff by philosophical entities. You know, stuff that people absolutely need. Additionally, things like banking and jet fuel are VAT exempt, but seeing as the IMF requires Mozambique to maintain liquidity in its financial sector whilst increasing VAT revenues by 1.25% of GDP by 2022, it's not really grounds to be optimistic. And yeah, I'm citing an IMF report as evidence of how bad they are. They've got sufficiently terrible that they don't even bother to hide it. Hi, I'm jumping in from the Vaporwave future just to say that I'm going to be using the term epistemology a fair bit, and for anyone unfamiliar with the term, it's just the area of philosophy which studies knowledge. So how did the John Stuart Mill brand of racism get into the IMF? Straight up racism isn't really in fashion with the fiscal intelligentsia these days, and there actually seems to be quite a lot of racial diversity amongst the IMF research staff. The IMF likes to be very evidence-based, and they publish a rather extensive amount of research. From having a little flick through it, I think there's a bit of a pattern. I can't find their meeting transcripts and such like, so I can't say how they actually go about applying their research to the process of granting loans. However, from the focus of much of their research, they don't seem to fit the typical portrayal of purely focusing on nasty things like freedom for international banking or whatever. They have a number of papers focusing on nice things like welfare. The IMF states that the papers they publish represent the views of the researchers who wrote them, not necessarily the IMF themselves. Thus, it's of course entirely possible that they don't actually care about welfare. However, it seems safe to treat the main methodological thrust of these papers as representative of general epistemic trends within the IMF. Whilst the IMF focuses on factors like welfare, they tend to focus on them in a bit of a weird way. Let's have a closer look at one paper, Competition, Competitiveness and Growth in Sub-Saharan Africa. I think it can kind of help us see where things start going horribly wrong. The paper primarily argues that an increasing competition can cause a significant interest in real GDP per capita. This makes the standard pitfall of economics of seeing growth in GDP as necessarily good. However, this paper also looks at the relation between competition and welfare, which is where it gets a bit interesting. The paper's methodology is solely based on data analysis, and it concludes that increasing competition may help to lower prices as indicated by the strongly negative relationship between the local competition intensity index and prices of most goods and services, thereby improving welfare and the external competitiveness of economies. Here, through the numerical study of welfare, we see that any actual experience of welfare is ignored. The people of Mozambique are discounted from being people by the exclusion of considering their experiences of the policies done to them. To the IMF, they seem almost as much of a passive mass or mysterious darkness as they were to Mill or Conrad. Hi, I'm just jumping back in from the Vaporwave future just to say sorry for the absence of colour in that section. Pressed the wrong button. The IMF's reliance on data and economic theory create an illegitimate sense of legitimacy, which the IMF then uses as their self-justification for their policies. The cultural or racial superiority of the John Stuart Mill brand of racism has now shifted to a superiority based on science and data analytics. The IMF brand of racism isn't distributed on purely racial lines and doesn't use any racial terminology. Nonetheless, it follows many of the epistemic trends of white supremacy. You can trace these trends through the history of economics from Mills and Ricardo, but that's a story for another time.
Anyway, to wrap up, I wanted to make another point on top of situating IMF policy within a history of white supremacy. It was about how the study of knowledge shouldn't exclude factors like the racialization of knowledge as peripheral historical quirks. Also, the study of trends in the formation of social knowledge can be pretty handy in political analysis. Maybe it's less stodgy than thinking of everything as ideology, and can be a bit more material than discourse analysis. Anyway, thanks, bye.